I'm Bryce and welcome to my 3D game assignment. After a quick write-up of the general game idea, inspired by Black Ops Arcade, and sketching up a few levels in Paint, Hotline Miami was born, an arcade-style shooter where Tim, the main character, takes it upon himself to eradicate the mutant moles invading his city. I set up a GitHub repo in the very beginning to source control my project, which not only allowed me to access it anywhere, but when needed I could revert any changes if something were to go wrong. I made sure to make commits regularly when something new was implemented successfully. I started with a completely blank project and brought in a sky sphere, directional light, and post-processing volume to set up the scene initially. I used an Unreal Terrain tool to create and manipulate my playable area while whiteboxing my level. And these are the progress pictures taken throughout development. Unreal's water plugin was used for custom water body, adjusted for less waves in the scene. Photoshop was used to create the sand part of my landscape material, using an image taken by camera and adjusting the color overlay blending mode in Photoshop to better fit my game. In the top right of the screen, using blueprints in Unreal, I created landscape painting layers for the sand texture I created and the grass from the start content. Using my sand texture from Photoshop, I then passed my news texture into a normal map tool online to create more texture on the sand in my game. Multiple walking animations were used from Mixamo for my player character to be later used for omnidirectional movement using blend spaces. After setting up all my player controls in the project settings, including controller support, Level 1 was finally ready for its completion. A custom skybox was added using an HDRI from Google Street View and created a material that was attached to a sphere that encompassed the level. Trees, rocks and grass were downloaded from the Epic Store to help furnish the level with foliage, while bounding boxes were added to keep the player within the play area. The chairs, umbrella and dock were created in Maya as final touches to the level. UVs and basic materials were created in Maya to then be used in Adobe Substance Painter to finalize these assets. I decided early on what enemies I would have and how they would look, so I created my mole enemy in Maya and used its rigging and animation tools to create multiple animations for the mole, as well as hit montages within Unreal when the player shot the enemy. From the 10 animations from Mixamo, 8 of which were for movement, I created an animation blueprint for my character to switch states from idle to walk, run, aiming, and death sequences. The use of blend spaces for 8 movement animations was created, catering for the speed of the player which they were moving at, as well as the direction, allowing the player to seamlessly transition to whichever direction they wanted to move in at any given speed. Using the horizontal axis to determine the direction on a 360-degree axis, and the vertical for speed, corresponding animations were added to then be used in the animation graph. Audacity was used in a variety of ways to bring sound to my game, including dynamically through walking. With the use of physics materials integrated into my ground materials, I was able to use animation notify events and line traces to identify the material walking on and changed audio based on this. Pixel Art Online was used to create small in-game UI elements that were finished in Photoshop to then be brought into Unreal for the user interface. Images, progress bars, text elements, and other buttons were also used to create an interactive and responsive user interface for the player. With the use of the timeline and keyframe animations, custom menu animations were included too. Customized particle effects for shooting the enemy were created using Photoshop for the image and bringing it into Effectsia to generate particles for when the enemy was shot. Resizing and timing were then refined once it was brought into Unreal. The moles were designed to be strong against the player, so a small cooldown was implemented between hit events so that the player was not killed too quickly. But also, the moles have also been designed to push the player around on hit events, so that they are able to push them into corners or push them towards other moles. The AI for the moles originally had a move to blueprint. Once spawned in, they endlessly followed the player from any distance, so a behavior tree was implemented to give the enemy a slightly more sophisticated behavior. Setting up the behavior tree's blueprints for a customized AI controller, I gave the enemy a passive roam behavior that would play indefinitely, where they would walk to a location and waited a few seconds before moving again. When they saw the player using a pawn sensing component, Once the player steps into the field of view, the mole then comes towards the player, attacking using blackboard decorators to make this decision. Using a blackboard, I was able to set conditional parameters that simple blueprints could not, but also allows the ease of expansion if necessary. For procedural generation, I decided to create modularized buildings for my second level. Using Maya, I created modules for the buildings comprised of corner, middle, floor, and roof sections. All those models were then exported out of Maya into Blender to be used in the procedural capabilities Blender had. Using the geometry nodes within Blender, I was able to set up where the modules would get used and at what frequency, with the majority of the calculations being Boolean math for rotations for specific side walls, removal of unnecessary interior geometry, and being able to identify ground and roof modules. Finally, exposing height, depth, and width sliders with the addition of decorative walls and windowed floors, I was able to now create varying size buildings with different attributes with a quick adjustment and exporting back into Maya for UV mapping and texturing. A Blender node to Python tool was used to export these nodes as a plugin for me to now be able to have a fully customized building creation tool plugin at hand in any Blender project in the future. For my custom shader, using scene textures and getting the desaturation for both values for the post-processing volume and scene texture diffuse, I created a shadow cutoff, separating areas of the scene that were lit and unlit. A mask was then also created for the areas that were lit using a lerp to display the correct color in the scene that were not in shadow. For the skybox to be displayed correctly, a scene depth node was added, increasing the maximum distance until it was no longer affected by the post-processing volume shader. Once my shadows were now able to be manipulated, I created a simple black and white line texture for the shadow areas. I then used high-level shader language to condense some of the nodes by first writing up the script in Notepad. A custom node was then used to implement the script, maintaining the desired effect.